The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse had been driven too hard through the fog-choked lanes of the English countryside. It bore the wax seal of the House of Ashworth, a seal that had not been broken in nearly 11 years. The housekeeper who received it did not smile. She only stared at the crimson wax for a long moment, as though she already understood that whatever lay folded inside that paper would change the course of a young woman's life forever. The manor at Larkspur Hall stood grey and silent beneath a sky heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. Ivy clung to its stone walls like a memory refusing to let go. Somewhere behind those shuttered windows, candle flames flickered against draughts that crept through corridors no one had walked in years. It was the kind of house that seemed to be waiting for someone to return, or perhaps for someone to finally uncover what had been buried within its walls for over a decade. The Duke of Ashworth, a man whose name alone could silence a ballroom, had sent that letter with his own hand. Edmund Ashworth was not a man given to sentiment. He was known throughout the county as cold, precise, and utterly unmovable, a man who measured his words the way a merchant measured gold, sparingly and only when necessary. Yet on that particular morning, as the ink dried upon the page addressed to a young woman he had met only once in his life, something in his expression betrayed a struggle he would never admit to another living soul. He had inherited many things from his late father: titles, lands, debts whispered about only in private drawing rooms, and a vineyard so ruined it had become something of a family shame, spoken of only in hushed tones behind closed doors. That vineyard, called Whitmare Vale, had once been the pride of the Ashworth name. Its wines had graced the tables of kings. But that was a different age, before scandal, before ruin, before the silence that had settled over the estate like a shroud. No one in the house spoke of what had truly happened at Whitmare Vale. The servants who remained were old, tight-lipped, and fiercely loyal to secrets they had sworn never to reveal. And yet, on this particular Tuesday morning, the Duke had made a decision that would unravel everything the family had spent 11 years trying to keep buried. He was giving the vineyard away, not to a nobleman, not to a distant cousin eager for land. He was giving it to a woman with no title, no fortune, and no claim to nobility whatsoever. A woman named Eleanor Vance, whose only inheritance in life had been her intelligence, her quiet dignity, and a grief so deep it had reshaped the very core of who she was. She did not yet understand why he had chosen her. She did not yet understand what waited for her beneath the soil of that ruined vineyard, hidden in the walls of that crumbling manor house, locked away in journals no one had dared to read in over a decade. What remained hidden was far more dangerous than a simple inheritance. It was a secret that had cost a man his reputation, a family its honour, and a woman her freedom. Years later, when the wines of Whitmare Vale would be poured in the finest halls of the kingdom, few would remember how it all began, with a letter, a broken seal, and a woman who was never meant to inherit anything at all. But before we continue deeper into this story of ruin, revival, and the truth that nearly destroyed an entire noble house, if you find yourself drawn into tales like this, stories of forgotten estates, buried secrets, and women who rise from nothing to become legends whispered about in aristocratic drawing rooms, then do take a moment now to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next chapter of English historical drama brought to life. And I would love to know, where in the world are you watching this story from tonight? Leave it in the comments below. I read every single one, and it always warms my heart to see how far these stories travel, from quiet towns to bustling cities across the globe. Now, let us return to Eleanor Vance and the letter that would change her life forever. Eleanor Vance was 23 years of age when the letter reached her small rented room above a bookbinder's shop in the town of Ashford. She was not a woman anyone would have noticed in a crowded room. Plain grey dresses, hair pinned back without ornament, hands roughened by years of honest labour. And yet, there was something in her eyes, a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished no matter how cruelly life had treated her. Her story, like so many others of that era, began with loss. Her father had been a respected wine merchant once, a man of modest means but considerable knowledge, who had spent years travelling the vineyards of France and Spain before settling into a quiet trade, importing bottles for the households of lesser gentry. He had taught his daughter everything he knew, the way to judge a grape by its colour in candlelight, the way to detect rot hidden beneath a beautiful vine, the patience required to coax greatness from soil that seemed to offer nothing at all. But her father's business had collapsed when Eleanor was but 17, the victim of a partner's betrayal and a debt that swallowed everything the family owned. He died 2 winters later, his heart broken as much by shame as by illness, leaving Eleanor and her ailing mother with nothing but memories and a single trunk of old wine journals that no one else thought worth keeping. Her mother passed the following spring. Eleanor buried her beside her father in a small churchyard where the headstones leaned like old friends whispering to one another in the wind, and from that day forward, she was entirely alone in the world. She had taken work wherever she could find it, mending linens for a vicar's wife, keeping ledgers for a merchant who paid her half what he paid his male clerks, teaching reading to children whose parents could spare only a few coins each month. She lived modestly, spoke little of her past, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that unsettled those who expected a woman in her position to be broken by circumstance. She was not broken. She was simply waiting, though she could not have said for what. The social world she had once belonged to, however distantly, had closed its doors to her entirely. Invitations ceased. Old acquaintances looked away when they passed her in the street, as though poverty were a disease one might catch through mere proximity. She had once been permitted, as a merchant's daughter, to stand at the edges of society's grand assemblies. Now she was invisible to it, a ghost wandering the same streets she had once walked, with her head held high. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, grey and unremarkable, that the messenger found her at the bookbinder's shop, breathless from his ride, holding a letter sealed with crimson wax, bearing a crest she recognised only vaguely from childhood memories of her father speaking reverently of the great vineyards of England. She did not understand, at first, why a duke would write to her. She had never met the man beyond a single brief and forgettable introduction at her father's funeral, when he had stood at the back of the small church, cloaked in dark wool, saying nothing, watching everything. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was short. It offered her, in cold and formal language, ownership of a property called Whitmere Vale, a vineyard, along with its accompanying manor house, described only as being in a state of considerable disrepair. There was no explanation of why. There was no mention of her father, though she would later come to understand that her father's name was woven through the story of that vineyard in ways she could not yet imagine. There was only an instruction to arrive within the fortnight, and a warning, oddly phrased, that she should tell no one of where she was going. She did not sleep that night. She sat by her small window with the letter in her lap, staring out at the darkened street, wondering what kind of trap she was being invited into, for surely, she thought, no one simply gave away an inheritance to a stranger without reason. And yet what choice did she have? She owned nothing. She belonged nowhere. If this was a trap, it was at least a door, and she had spent 6 long years standing before nothing but walls. She packed her single trunk within 3 days. The journey to Whitmere Vale took the better part of a week, through roads that grew narrower and wilder the further she travelled from the comforts of town, until at last her carriage crested a low hill, and she saw it for the first time. The vineyard, spread across the valley below, like a wound that had never properly healed. Rows of vines, twisted and neglected, ran in crooked lines toward a horizon shrouded in mist. Beyond them stood the manor house itself, its stone facade darkened by decades of rain. Its windows shuttered like closed eyes, refusing to witness whatever had happened within. She did not yet understand that the house had not always been silent. She did not yet understand that somewhere behind those shuttered windows, an old scandal slept, waiting only for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to wake it. The carriage came to a halt before the great iron gates, rusted now and hanging slightly askew upon their hinges, and Eleanor stepped down onto the gravel drive, with her heart pounding beneath her modest travelling coat. An elderly steward emerged from the house to greet her, his expression unreadable, his bow correct but distant, as though he had been instructed to offer courtesy without warmth. "You are Miss Vance," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she answered. He studied her for a long moment, and something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or sorrow, or both. "His Grace said you would come," the steward murmured before turning to lead her inside. "Though I confess, madam, I did not believe it until this very moment." She did not ask what he meant. She would come to understand, in time, that very few things at Whitmere Vale were ever explained plainly. Everything had to be discovered, layer by layer, like sediment settling at the bottom of an old and troubled wine. The manor's interior was even more desolate than its exterior had suggested. Dust lay thick upon every surface, undisturbed for what appeared to be years. Portraits lined the long central hallway, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. Stern-faced ancestors of the Ashworth line, their expressions frozen in judgment. One portrait, larger than the rest, hung slightly crooked above the great staircase, a young woman in a gown of pale blue, her face turned partly away from the viewer, as though she wished not to be seen at all. Eleanor paused before it, feeling an inexplicable chill settle over her shoulders. "Who is she?" she asked the steward. The old man's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "That, madam, is a story for another day," he said, and continued walking, leaving Eleanor to stare a moment longer at the portrait before hurrying to catch up. She was given a modest room on the second floor, plainly furnished but clean, overlooking the ruined vineyard below. That first night, as rain finally began to fall against her window in soft, rhythmic patterns, she found herself unable to sleep, her mind turning over questions that multiplied faster than she could answer them. Why had the Duke given her this estate? Why the secrecy? Who was the woman in the portrait, and why did the servants speak of her only in careful, guarded tones? She did not yet know that the answers to these questions were hidden throughout the very walls she now called home, in locked drawers, in old journals, in letters tucked behind loose stones, waiting patiently for someone with the persistence to find them. The following morning, she began her exploration of the estate in earnest, starting with the vineyard itself. What she found broke something tender within her chest. The vines, though neglected, were not dead, merely abandoned, strangled by weeds and choked by years of indifference. Beneath the ruin, she recognized the bones of something extraordinary. Her father had spoken, in his final years, of a fabled English vineyard whose wines had once rivaled the great houses of Bordeaux before scandal and mismanagement drove it into obscurity. She had never imagined she would one day stand among those very vines herself. She spent that first week walking every row, examining soil, testing the health of roots buried deep beneath decades of neglect, filling a small notebook with observations in the careful, precise handwriting her father had taught her. The work steadied her mind even as the mysteries of the house continued to multiply around her. For there were mysteries, many of them, each one stranger than the last. She noticed, on her second evening, that a particular door on the third floor remained locked at all times, and that the housemaid who cleaned that corridor grew visibly uneasy whenever Eleanor lingered near it. She noticed that meals were served precisely, without variation, as though the household operated according to a routine established long ago and never questioned since. She noticed that the steward, kind though he tried to be, would fall suddenly silent whenever she asked questions about the previous mistress of the house, or about why the vineyard had fallen to ruin in the first place. No one in the house spoke of it, and yet everyone in the house seemed to know something she did not. It was on the 9th day of her residence that she found the first true clue, quite by accident, while searching the library for old records pertaining to the vineyard's harvests. Tucked between the pages of a ledger dated some 11 years prior, she discovered a folded letter. Its ink faded, but still legible, addressed to no one in particular, written in a hand she did not recognize. The letter spoke of debts, of desperation, of a decision made in secrecy that the writer feared would ruin us all should it ever come to light. It mentioned no names directly, but it referenced a vineyard sale that had never been properly recorded and a sum of money that had vanished from the estate's accounts without explanation. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully back into the ledger, her pulse quickening with the particular thrill of a woman who has just glimpsed the edge of something far larger than herself. She did not yet understand who had written it or what secret it protected, but she understood with growing certainty that the ruin of Whitmare Vale had not been an accident of poor harvests or bad fortune. Someone, at some point, had made a choice, and that choice had cost the estate everything. She began to search more deliberately after that, moving from room to room with the quiet determination of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had grown rather skilled at proving people wrong. She found, in a drawer beneath the study desk, a stack of correspondence between the late Duke, Edmund's father, and a solicitor in London, discussing what was cryptically referred to only as the arrangement concerning the vineyard's true ownership. She found, hidden behind a loose panel in the library wall, a small locked box containing nothing but a single brass key, its purpose unknown. And she found, perhaps most troubling of all, a journal belonging to a woman whose name had been carefully removed from its cover. Though her handwriting filled every page within, a woman who wrote of loneliness within these very walls, of a marriage entered under obligation rather than affection, and of a terrible decision she had been forced to make to protect someone she loved from ruin. The journal's final entry, dated some 11 years prior, read simply, "If they find what I have done, they will call it theft, but I call it survival. God forgive me for what comes next." Eleanor closed the journal slowly, her hands trembling, and looked up to find the portrait of the young woman in pale blue, watching her from across the room, as though waiting for her to finally understand. She did not yet understand, but she would. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened into the first frosts of the coming winter, Eleanor divided her days between the restoration of the vineyard and the slow, careful unravelling of the house's secrets. She learned to read the moods of the ancient soil the way her father had taught her, discovering pockets of exceptional clay-rich earth that had once produced the estate's most celebrated vintages, buried now beneath years of neglect, but far from lost. She began, with the help of an elderly groundskeeper named Thomas, one of the few servants willing to speak with any candour, to clear the oldest and most valuable rows of vines, working alongside him in the cold morning air until her hands blistered and her back ached in ways she had never known. Thomas, it turned out, remembered more than he initially let on. Over weeks of careful conversation, earned through patience rather than pressure, he began to share fragments of the past, how the vineyard had once employed nearly 40 workers, how its wines had been served at a royal banquet some 15 years before, and how everything had changed almost overnight following what he called only the scandal, his voice dropping each time he spoke the word, as though it might summon something best left undisturbed. "What scandal?" Eleanor asked him one bitter morning, as frost clung to the vines like a fine lace shroud. Thomas hesitated, his weathered face creasing with old sorrow. "It is not my place to say, miss, but I will tell you this much. The old Duchess did not simply pass away as the family claims, and whatever truly happened to her, His Grace has spent 11 years trying to bury it deeper than any of these vines." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the frost. "The Duchess," she repeated softly. "The woman in the portrait." Thomas said nothing more, but the look in his eyes confirmed everything she had begun to suspect. She returned to the library that same evening and read the hidden journal again, this time searching not merely for sentiment, but for names, dates, anything that might connect the desperate woman who had written those pages to the portrait hanging above the staircase. She found, tucked into the journal's final pages, a pressed flower, a sprig of lavender, faded nearly to grey, and beneath it, in handwriting far smaller than the rest, a single line that had escaped her notice before: "For my daughter, should she ever come looking." Eleanor sat very still for a long moment, the journal open upon her lap, the candle beside her guttering in a draught that seemed to come from nowhere at all. A daughter. She had assumed, all this time, that the mystery belonged entirely to the Ashworth family, to the Duke, to his father, to whatever scandal had swallowed the old Duchess 11 years before. She had not once considered that the mystery might also belong to her. There were other mysteries too, smaller ones, that surfaced during those long autumn weeks, like stones rising slowly through disturbed water. Eleanor noticed, on more than one occasion, that a single candle burned each night in the window of the vineyard's old pressing house, though no one among the staff would admit to lighting it, and Thomas himself grew strangely quiet whenever she raised the subject, muttering only that it was old habit, miss, best left undisturbed. She noticed, too, that the household ledgers from 11 years prior contained a curious gap, nearly 4 months of entries torn cleanly from the binding, as though someone had wished certain transactions to vanish entirely from memory. And she noticed that whenever she mentioned the name of the wine merchant who had once advised the estate on its vines, the housekeeper's hands would still upon whatever task occupied them, just for a moment, before resuming their work with a briskness that seemed designed to discourage further questions. She began keeping a private record of these small oddities in the back pages of her father's old wine journal, certain that each one, however trivial it appeared alone, formed part of a larger pattern she had not yet learned to read. The torn ledger pages troubled her most of all, for they corresponded precisely to the period during which, according to the letters she would later discover, the affair between her mother and the merchant had reached its most perilous point, the point at which discovery had become not merely possible, but, it seemed, almost inevitable. Someone, she came to believe, had gone to considerable trouble to erase the financial record of whatever arrangement had been made to send her away in secrecy. Perhaps fearing that a curious solicitor or a suspicious husband might one day trace the payments back to their true purpose. It was several nights later, during a violent autumn storm that rattled the manor's old windows and sent draughts sighing through every corridor, that Eleanor finally found the locked room on the 3rd floor unlocked, whether by accident or design, she could not say. She stepped inside cautiously, her candle throwing long shadows across furniture draped in white sheets, and found, upon a small writing desk beneath the room's single shuttered window, a wooden chest bound with iron fittings, sealed with a lock that matched precisely the brass key she had discovered weeks before. Her hands shook as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, reluctant click, as though the chest itself had been waiting a very long time to be opened. Inside she found letters, dozens of them, tied in careful bundles with faded ribbon, spanning what appeared to be several years of correspondence between the old Duchess and a man whose signature she did not recognize at first, until she noticed the surname matched her own mother's maiden name precisely. She read late into the night, piecing together a story that had been buried for over a decade. The old Duchess, it seemed, had fallen deeply and secretly in love with a wine merchant many years her social inferior, a man who had travelled to Whitmer Vale to advise on the restoration of its ailing vines, and who had instead restored something far more fragile within the Duchess's own weary heart. Their affair, conducted in stolen moments and secret letters, had produced a daughter, born quietly and sent away under circumstances the letters described only obliquely, referred to always as the arrangement that would protect the child from scandal while ensuring she was never entirely without care. Eleanor read the merchant's final letter to the Duchess, with tears blurring her vision, for the handwriting, though older and more hurried than she remembered, was unmistakably her father's. She was the daughter. She had been sent away as an infant to be raised by a kind couple who loved her as their own, their identities carefully protected, their connection to the great house never spoken of, not even to Eleanor herself. Her father, the man she had known and loved and buried, had not been her father by blood at all, but a man who had loved her mother enough to raise her child as his own, asking nothing in return but the quiet dignity of never having to explain. The old Duchess had died, the final letters revealed, not of illness, as the family had always claimed, but of a broken heart, hastened by the cruelty of a husband who had discovered her secret and never forgiven it. A husband who had, in his fury and shame, driven the vineyard itself into deliberate ruin rather than allow it to flourish under the shadow of what he considered his wife's betrayal. And that husband, Eleanor now understood with a cold and terrible clarity, had been the current Duke's own father. Edmund Ashworth had grown up in the wreckage of his parents' broken marriage, raised by a father embittered by scandal and a mother who lived only long enough to hide her daughter's true parentage before grief finally claimed her. He had inherited not merely a ruined vineyard, but a lifetime of silence, of unspoken guilt, of a secret he had likely only recently begun to fully understand himself. Eleanor did not yet know how much the Duke himself knew of the truth she had just uncovered. She did not yet know whether he had sent her to Whitmer Vale out of guilt or duty or something else entirely that he himself could not name. But she understood. Sitting alone in that cold-locked room with her mother's letters scattered across her lap, that the vineyard she had been so mysteriously given was not merely an inheritance. It was, in every sense that mattered, her true birthright. Word spread quickly through the county once the Duke's decision to summon Miss Vance to Whitmer Vale became known beyond the estate's iron gates. Neighbouring gentry whispered over afternoon tea about the strange arrangement, certain there must be some scandal behind it, though none could quite agree upon its shape. Among those who took a particular and unwelcome interest was Lord Cassius Whitfield, a distant cousin of the Ashworth line, who had spent years quietly hoping the vineyard, ruined as it was, might one day fall into his own hands through some legal manoeuvring or another. He had grown accustomed to the assumption that the estate, unproductive and unwanted, would eventually be sold off cheaply, and himself positioned conveniently to acquire it. The news that the Duke had instead gifted the property outright to an unknown young woman of no fortune whatsoever struck Lord Whitfield as both baffling and deeply inconvenient. He arrived at Whitmer Vale unannounced one grey afternoon, ostensibly to pay his respects to a cousin's newly appointed tenant. Though his true purpose was plain enough to Eleanor from the moment his eyes swept assessingly over the vineyard's slowly recovering rows. "You have taken on quite an ambitious project, Miss Vance," he said, his tone dripping with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. One wonders what could possibly have persuaded His Grace to entrust so significant a property to someone so entirely unconnected to it. Perhaps he simply believed I was capable, Eleanor replied evenly, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. Lord Whitfield's smile thinned. Capability is a fine quality, madam, though rarely sufficient on its own in matters of this importance. I do hope, for your sake, that whatever arrangement exists between yourself and my cousin proves as straightforward as it appears. The threat, though delivered with impeccable politeness, was unmistakable, and Eleanor understood in that moment that Lord Whitfield would not simply allow her claim to the estate to go unchallenged should he ever suspect the truth of her parentage. A truth that, if proven, would complicate the Ashworth inheritance in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She said nothing of her discoveries to anyone, not even to Thomas, whose loyalty she trusted, but whose safety she was reluctant to endanger. She continued her work in the vineyard through the harsh winter months, nursing the old vines back toward health, with a patience that surprised even herself, while quietly continuing to search the manor for whatever remaining pieces of the puzzle still eluded her. It was in early spring, as the first tender shoots began to appear along the vineyard's oldest rows, that the Duke himself finally returned to Whitmere Vale. Eleanor had not seen Edmund Ashworth since the brief and distant introduction at her father's funeral so many years before, and she found herself entirely unprepared for the effect his presence had upon the household the moment his carriage rolled through the estate's rusted gates. Servants who had moved through the halls with quiet, unhurried routine suddenly straightened their postures and lowered their eyes. The steward's careful composure cracked, just slightly, into something that looked almost like relief mixed with dread. The Duke found her in the vineyard itself, standing among the recovering vines with soil beneath her fingernails and her hair coming loose from its pins, entirely unlike the composed young woman who might have been expected to greet a duke properly within the manor's formal drawing-room. He studied her for a long moment before speaking, his expression unreadable in the way she now understood to be characteristic of the entire Ashworth line, a family that had learned, through generations of hidden scandal, to guard every emotion behind a mask of aristocratic composure. "You have done more with these vines in half a year than my father's stewards managed in 11, he said finally, his voice low and measured. "Your father's stewards were not trying to save something they loved," Eleanor replied. "I believe that makes a considerable difference." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or the faintest trace of something warmer. "You speak as though you have some personal connection to this land, Miss Vance." She met his gaze steadily, deciding in that moment that the time for careful silence had passed. "I believe I do, Your Grace, though I suspect you already knew that when you sent for me." The colour drained slightly from his composed expression. "What exactly do you believe you know?" She told him then, of the journal, of the letters, of the pressed lavender, and the single line written for a daughter who might one day come looking. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, searching for deception, for surprise, for anything that might reveal how much of this truth he had already carried within himself. What she found instead was something closer to grief. "I did not know for certain," he admitted quietly, when she had finished. "I suspected. My mother's final letter to me, delivered only after her death, spoke of a daughter she had been forced to give away, and of a debt of conscience she hoped I might one day help repay. Though she gave me no name, no location, nothing but a description of the man she had loved and the approximate year in which the child had been born. I spent years searching quietly, discreetly, unwilling to disturb whatever peace that child might have found in her own life. When I learned of your father's passing and of the timing that aligned so precisely with what my mother had described, I could not ignore the possibility any longer." "And so you gave me the vineyard," Eleanor said slowly, "not merely as an inheritance, but as a way of finally repaying what your mother could not." "I gave it to you," he corrected gently, "because it was always meant to be yours." My father drove it into ruin out of spite toward a wife who found happiness he could never give her. I could not undo the pain he caused, but I could, at least, return to you what should never have been taken away. The weight of years of silence, of buried grief, of a scandal both families had spent over a decade trying desperately to forget, seemed to settle over the vineyard itself in that moment, as though the very vines had been waiting, patient as old wine in a forgotten cellar, for the truth to finally be spoken aloud. But truth, once spoken, has a way of demanding consequence, and Lord Whitfield had not remained idle during the months of Eleanor's quiet investigation. He had, through channels both legal and considerably less scrupulous, learned enough of the old scandal to construct his own version of events, one considerably less generous than the truth, and considerably more useful to his ambitions. He arrived at Whitmere Vale barely a fortnight after the Duke's own arrival, accompanied by a solicitor and a folder of documents he claimed proved Eleanor's inheritance illegitimate on the grounds that any child born of the late Duchess's affair held no legal claim whatsoever to Ashworth property. Regardless of the current Duke's personal wishes in the matter, worse still, he suggested with barely veiled malice, that the scandal itself, should it become public knowledge, would destroy what little remained of the family's reputation, and that Eleanor's continued presence at Whitmere Vale threatened to expose secrets that both families had spent a fortune and 11 years of silence trying to protect. You would ruin an entire family's name, Lord Whitfield said coldly, standing in the Manor's great hall with his solicitor at his side, merely to satisfy your own ambitions toward a fortune you were never meant to inherit. I want nothing exposed, Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. I want only what was always mine by right, quietly and without scandal, precisely as His Grace has already granted it. And if I choose to make this matter considerably less quiet, Lord Whitfield pressed, if I choose to inform every drawing room in the county of the true circumstances surrounding your birth, and your mother's disgrace. It was the Duke who answered, stepping forward with a coldness in his voice that Eleanor had not yet heard directed at anyone but herself. Then you will find yourself exposing considerably more than my mother's private grief. Cousin, you will expose my father's deliberate ruin of this estate, a decision made not out of financial necessity, as has always been claimed, but out of spite toward a dying woman, a decision that cost dozens of workers their livelihoods and drove this family's name into disrepute far more thoroughly than any scandal involving love ever could. I have documents enough, gathered these past several months, to make that particular truth considerably more damaging to you than to me, should you insist on making a public matter of any of this. Lord Whitfield's composure faltered for the first time since his arrival. He had clearly not anticipated that the Duke himself might be willing to expose his own father's failures rather than sacrifice Eleanor's rightful claim. You would destroy your own father's memory, he said slowly. For a woman you have known scarcely half a year, I would destroy a false memory, the Duke replied, to preserve a true one. My mother deserved better than the silence she was given. I do not intend to let her daughter inherit that same silence. Lord Whitfield left Whitmere Vale that same evening, his threats withdrawn, his ambitions toward the estate quietly abandoned in the face of consequences he had not anticipated needing to weigh. He would trouble the estate no further, though the confrontation left Eleanor understanding, more clearly than ever, the price the Duke had been willing to pay to protect what remained of her mother's memory and her own rightful place within it. The months that followed brought a transformation to Whitmere Vale that the oldest servants swore they had not witnessed since the estate's most prosperous years, decades before. Eleanor threw herself into the vineyard's restoration with a devotion that seemed almost to breathe new life into the very soil itself. She employed local families who had once depended upon the estate for their livelihood, restoring not merely vines, but an entire community that had languished in the vineyard's long shadow of ruin. Thomas, the old groundskeeper, wept openly the first morning the restored eastern vines showed their first true harvest of grapes in over a decade, calling it nothing short of a miracle. Though Eleanor knew it to be nothing more than patience, knowledge, and the particular determination of a woman who finally understood she was fighting not merely for an inheritance, but for her mother's memory. The Duke visited more frequently as the months passed, his cold reputation softening, ever so slightly, in ways the household staff noted with quiet, hopeful glances they were careful never to voice aloud. Whatever grew between Eleanor and Edmund during those long months of restoration was never spoken of plainly, in the manner of the great romances celebrated in novels and ballads. It grew instead the way the vineyard itself grew, slowly, patiently, through careful tending and quiet devotion, until neither of them could quite recall the precise moment when respect had deepened into something considerably warmer. The first true harvest came in the autumn of the following year, nearly 18 months after Eleanor had first arrived at Whitmere Vale, with nothing but a single trunk and a letter she had barely understood. The grapes that year were extraordinary, rich, deeply coloured, carrying within them the particular character of soil that had rested fallow for over a decade, allowing minerals and richness to accumulate in ways that younger vineyards could never replicate. Eleanor, drawing upon everything her father, her true father, in every sense that mattered beyond mere blood, had taught her of the delicate alchemy required to transform grape into greatness, oversaw the pressing and fermentation with a precision and patience that impressed even the most sceptical of the old wine merchants who had once dismissed Whitmere Vale as a lost cause. The wine that emerged from that first true harvest was unlike anything the county had tasted in a generation. Word of it spread first through modest circles, a merchant here, a country gentleman there, each remarking upon a depth of flavour and complexity that seemed to speak of both ruin and rebirth in equal measure. Within 2 years, bottles bearing the newly restored Whitmere Vale crest were being requested by name in the finest establishments of London, and within 5 years, the vineyard's reputation had grown to rival, and some whispered surpass, the great continental houses that had once dominated every noble table in the kingdom. Eleanor Vance, once a woman with no name worth mentioning in polite society, became known throughout England as the architect of one of the most remarkable revivals the wine trade had ever witnessed. She never spoke publicly of the scandal that had once threatened to consume her mother's memory, nor of the truth of her own birth, choosing instead to let the quality of her work speak for itself in a manner that required no further justification. The old Duchess's portrait, once left to gather dust in a forgotten corner of the manor's great staircase, was restored and rehung with quiet ceremony in the vineyard's own tasting hall, where visitors from across the kingdom would one day pause to admire the resemblance between the woman in pale blue and the celebrated vintner who had brought Whitmere Vale back from the very edge of ruin. Edmund Ashworth married Eleanor Vance in a quiet ceremony some 3 years after her arrival, attended only by those closest to them both, held not in the grand cathedral one might expect of a duke's wedding, but in the small stone chapel overlooking the vineyard itself, where morning light fell golden across rows of vines that had once stood dead and silent, and now flourished in a manner the oldest residents of the county still spoke of as nothing short of miraculous. It was said, in later years, that the finest bottle ever produced at Whitmere Vale bore a label depicting a single sprig of lavender pressed beneath the glass, a quiet tribute, understood fully by only 2 people in all the kingdom, to a woman who had once written, in the desperate hope of a mother separated from her child, that her daughter might one day come looking, and might one day forgive her for a choice made not out of cruelty, but out of love too large for the narrow world she had been given to live within. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy an entire noble house was, in time, transformed into something far different. Not a story of ruin, but of restoration. Not a tale of betrayal, but of a truth finally permitted to breathe after 11 long years of suffocating silence. The vineyard that the Duke had once handed to a stranger, as what many in the county assumed was merely a burden too troublesome to keep himself, became instead the very foundation upon which an entire family's reputation was rebuilt. Stone by stone, vine by vine, harvest by patient harvest. Eleanor never forgot the woman who had given birth to her, only to be forced to send her away, nor the man who had raised her as his own, without ever once making her feel the absence of a truth he so carefully protected her from. She kept her mother's journal locked within the very chest where she had first discovered it. Though she read it often, particularly during the quiet hours before each new harvest, drawing from its pages a strength that seemed to renew itself with every turning of the vineyard's ancient soil. And so it was that a bankrupt vineyard, handed away by a cold and grieving duke to a woman he barely knew, became in time the most celebrated wine estate in the entire kingdom. Not through the intervention of fortune or the favour of nobility, but through the quiet, unyielding determination of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated, and who chose, in the end, to let that underestimation become the very soil from which her triumph finally grew. Thomas lived long enough to see 3 full harvests gathered from the vines he had helped restore, and on the evening before he finally passed, peacefully in the small cottage at the vineyard's edge where he had lived his whole life, he told Eleanor at last why the candle had burned each night in the pressing house window. It had been, he confessed, a habit begun by the old Duchess herself in the final months before her death, a signal she had once lit for the merchant she loved, so that he might know it was safe to come near without fear of discovery. Thomas had continued lighting it long after her passing, he admitted, not out of superstition, but because some part of him had never quite believed she was entirely gone from the place she had loved so dearly, and he had not wished her to think herself forgotten. Eleanor lit that same candle herself every evening from that night onward, a quiet ritual carried forward in memory of a mother she had never truly known, yet had come, in every way that mattered, to understand completely. The torn pages of the old ledger were never fully explained, though Eleanor came, in time, to suspect that it had been the old Duchess herself who removed them, in one final act of protection for the child she was about to lose, ensuring that no clerk or solicitor could ever trace the arrangement back to its true and tender purpose. It was, Eleanor thought, a fitting mirror to her own life's work, a woman erasing evidence of sorrow so that something gentler might survive in its place, just as the vineyard itself had buried 11 years of ruin beneath soil that, given patience and care, proved capable of yielding something extraordinary after all. In the years that followed, Whitmere Vale became more than merely a celebrated vineyard. It became, quietly and without ever seeking such distinction, a place of second chances, a home for workers who had once been dismissed as too old or too unskilled to matter elsewhere, a refuge for the reputation of a woman long dead who had only ever wished to love without shame, and a testament to the particular kind of courage required to walk into a ruined inheritance and see, where others saw only failure, the patient possibility of rebirth. Visitors who travelled from London and beyond to taste the estate's celebrated vintages often remarked upon the peculiar warmth of the place, a feeling they could not quite name, as though the very stones of the manor had finally been permitted to rest easy after years of carrying a secret too heavy for silence alone. Eleanor and Edmund raised their own children within those restored walls, and though the old scandal was never entirely forgotten, it ceased, in time, to define the family whose name it had once threatened to destroy. Eleanor made certain, in her own quiet way, that her mother's portrait remained always in a place of honour, so that any child of the house might grow up knowing that love, even when forced into silence for a season, need never be erased entirely. that it might instead wait patiently, as vines wait through winter, for the season in which it is finally permitted to bloom. A story preserved in the quiet memory of an old English estate, carried forward not through grand proclamations or noble titles, but through bottles of wine poured in halls far from Whitmere Vale, each one carrying within it the patient, hard-won truth of a woman who was never meant to inherit anything at all, and who, in the end, inherited everything that truly mattered.